by the way, I wasn't watching the time, so it kind of ended a bit unexpected. Anyways, let's get started. We're on page 132, almost at the end. Nevile went scarlet. Harry glared at Snape. It was bad enough that he bullied Nevile in his own classes, let alone doing it in front of other teachers. Professor Lupin had raised his eyebrows. I was hoping that Nevile would assist me with the first stage of the operation, he said, and I am sure he will perform it admirably. Nevile's face went, if possible, even redder. Snape's lip curled, but he left, shutting the door with a snap. Now, then, said Professor Lupin, beckoning the class toward the end of the room, where there was nothing but an old wardrobe where the teachers kept their spare robes. As Professor Lupin went to stand next to it, the wardrobe gave a sudden wobble, banging off the wall. Nothing to worry about, said Professor Lupin calmly, as a few people had jumped backward in alarm. There is a boggart in there. Most people seemed to feel that this was something to worry about. Nevile gave Professor Lupin a look of pure terror, and Seamus Finnegan eyed the now rattling doorknob apprehensively. Boggarts like dark, enclosed spaces, said Professor Lupin. Wardrobes, the gap beneath the beds, the cupboard under sinks. I've even met one that had lodged itself in a grandfather clock. This one moved in yesterday afternoon, and I asked the headmaster if the staff would leave it to give my third years some practice. So, the first question we must ask ourselves is, what is a boggart? Hermione put up her hand. It's a shapeshifter, she said. It can take the shape of whatever it thinks will frighten us most. Couldn't have put it better myself, said Professor Lupin, and Hermione glowed. So, the boggart sitting in the darkness within has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a boggart looks like when he is alone, but when I let him out, he will immediately become whatever each of us most fears. This means, said Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Nevile's small sputter of terror, that we have a huge advantage over the boggart before we begin. Have you spotted it, Harry? Trying to answer a question with Hermione next to him, bobbing up and down on the balls of her feet with her hand in the air was very off-putting. But Harry had to go. Because there are so many of us, it won't know what shape it should be? Precisely, said Professor Lupin, and Hermione put her hand down, looking a little disappointed. It's always best to have company when you're dealing with the boggart. He becomes confused. Which should he become? The headless corpse of a flesh-eating slug? I once saw a boggart make that very mistake. Try to frighten two people at once and turn himself into a half-slug. Not remotely frightening. The charm that repels a boggart is simple, yet it requires force of mind. See, the thing that really finishes boggart is laughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. We will practice the charm without wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous! Ridiculous! Said the class together. Good, said Professor Lupin. Very good. But that was the easy part, I'm afraid. You see, the word alone is not enough. And this is where you come in, Nevile. The wardrobe shook again, though not as much as Nevile, who walked forward as though he were heading for the gallows. Right, Nevile, said Professor Lupin. First things first. What would you say is the thing that frightens you most in the world? Nevile's lips moved, but no noise came out. Didn't catch that, Nevile. Sorry, said Professor Lupin cheerfully. Nevile looked around rather wildly, as though begging someone to help him, then said, in a barely more than a whisper, Professor Snape. Nearly everyone laughed. Even Nevile grinned apologetically. Professor Lupin, however, looked thoughtful. Professor Snape, Nevile, I believe you live with your grandmother? Yes, said Nevile nervously, but I don't want the boggart to turn into her either. No, no, you misunderstand me, said Professor Lupin, now smiling. I wonder what you could tell us what sort of clothes your grandmother usually wears? Navalio looked startled, but said, well, always the same hat, a tall one with a stuffed vulture on top, a long dress, green normally, and sometimes a fox fur scarf. And a handbag? Prompted Professor Lupin. A big red one, said Navalio. Right then, said Professor Lupin. Can you picture those clothes very clearly, Navalio? Can you see them in your mind's eye? Yes, said Navalio uncertainly, plainly wondering what was coming next. When the boggart burst out of this wardrobe, Navalio, and sees you, it will assume the form of Professor Snape, said Lupin, and you will raise your wand thus and cry, ridiculous, and concentrate hard on your grandmother's clothes. If all goes well, Professor Boggart Snape will be forced into that vulture-topped hat and that green dress with that big red handbag. There was a great shout of laughter. The wardrobe wobbled more violently. And the violence successful, the boggart is likely to shift his attention to each of us in turn, said Professor Lupin. I would like all of you to take a moment now to think of the thing that scares you the most, and imagine how you might force it to look comical. The room went quiet. Harry thought, what scared him most in the world? His first thought was Lord Voldemort. Voldemort returned to full strength. But before he could even started planning a possible con on a boggart Voldemort, a horrible image came floating to the surface of his mind. A rotting, glistening hen, slithering black beneath a black coat. A long, rattling breath from an unseen mouth. Then a cold so penetrating it felt like drowning. Harry shivered, then looked around, hoping no one had noticed. Many people had their eyes shut tight. Ron was muttering to himself, take its legs off. Harry was sure he knew what that was about. Ron's greatest fear was spiders. Everyone ready? Said Professor Lupin. Harry felt a lurch of fear. He wasn't ready. How could you make a Dementor less frightening? But he didn't want to ask for more time. Everyone else was nodding and rolling up their sleeves. Now I hope we're going to back away, said Professor Lupin, that you have a clear field. All right, I'll call the next person forward. Everyone, back now, so nobody can get a clear shot. They all retreated, back against the walls, leaving Navalio alone beside the wardrobe. He looked pale and frightened, but he had pushed up the sleeves of his robes and was holding his wand ready. On the count of three, Navalio, said Professor Lupin, was pointing his own wand at the handle of the wardrobe. 1, 2, 3, now! A jet of sparks shot from the end of Professor Lupin's wand and hit the doorknob. The wardrobe burst open. Hook-nosed and menacing, Professor Snape stepped out, his eyes flashing at Navalio. Navalio backed away, his wand up, mouthing wordlessly. Snape was bearing down upon him, reaching inside his robes. Ridiculous! Squeaked Navalio. There was a noise like a whip crack. Snape stumbled. He was wearing a long, lace-trimmed dress and a towering head topped with a moth-eaten vulture, and he was swinging a huge crimson handbag. There was a roar of laughter. The boggart paused, confused, and Professor Lupin shouted, Parvati, forward! Parvati walked forward, her face set. Snape rounded on her. There was another crack, and where he had stood was a blood-stained, bandaged mummy. Its sightless face was turned to Parvati, and it began to walk toward her very slowly, dragging its feet, its stiff arms rising. Ridiculous! Cried Parvati. A bandage unraveled at the mummy's feet and became entangled, fell face forward, and its head rolled off. Seamus! Roared Professor Lupin. Seamus started past Parvati. Crack! Where the mummy had been was a woman with floor-length black hair and a skeletal, green-tinged face. A banshee. She opened her mouth wide, and an unearthly sound filled the room. A long, wailing shriek that made the hair on Harry's head stand on end. Ridiculous! Shouted Seamus. The banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat. Her voice was gone. Crack! The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail in a circle. Then, crack!